Welcome back to AP US History. This is Chapter 3, Part 2, and we're going to be looking at the founding of Maryland. Lord Baltimore, or George Calvert, is going to be the man instrumental in bringing this about. He shows you Maryland, which is north of Virginia. The King of England owed Lord Baltimore a huge debt, convinces him to take a tract of land in the New World in lieu of the debt. This is considered a proprietorship colony owned by an individual. Virginia was a charter colony first and then reverts to a royal colony controlled by the king. Lord Baltimore wanted to establish a colony uh, for Catholics and also make a profit. One of the first pieces of legislation that he passes or institutes in the colony is the Act of Toleration. You'll need to know this for the AP exam because it's the first document written to protect religious rights. It granted that all Christians would could worship as they please, Catholic and Protestant. Unfortunately, it did not protect everyone in the colony. Um, Jews and atheists were executed, but it did grant some religious freedoms in the British colonies in North America. It will become the largest haven of Catholics in the colonies and continued for a number of years to be one of the state with the largest number of Catholics. How the plantation system worked, uh, tracts of land were cultivated by indentured servants who worked the land. The aristocrats would bring these indentured servants over from England. They would serve a period of 5 to 7 years to pay for their passage, and both men and women came to the New World. By 1700, about 100,000 indentured servants had traveled to Virginia and Maryland. The headright system is something that always seems to appear on the test in May. It was a government subsidy which said that if you would pay for the passage of people coming over, you would get 50 acres of land from the government. And this shows you some of the particulars about the contract. You were forbidden to marry, and unfortunately, only about 1 out of 10 survived past the contract. So landowners are going to receive more land for bringing people over, and it will help increase the number of settlers in the colony. In 1676, the first rebellion breaks out in the North American British colonies, and this is Bacon's Rebellion. A large number of frustrated former indentured servants are living on the frontier, and they're being harassed by Native Americans because they live among them. They're they're sort of vulnerable, uh, and they will seek help from the governor. Um, the rebellion doesn't last very long. Uh, Initially, they drive the governor out of Jamestown, and then later they're put down. But they want protection from Indians. Governor Berkeley refuses, doesn't want to upset the trading arrangements with the Indians, uh, and basically you're on your own. So Nathaniel Bacon mobilizes a militia to protect the settlers. And in 1676, they massacre some Indians first, mostly women and children, and then they set fire to Jamestown. Governor William Berkeley is forced to flee for his life. Later, he will take back Jamestown, the colony. Uh, Nathaniel Bacon will die a bloody flux, and some of his followers will be hanged. This shows a line that Berkeley drew initially, saying anyone west of that line would receive no protection. So it is a kind of a game changer, this rebellion, because the whites will grow to see that indentured servants are not all that reliable. They're going to be free, and then they'll make some demands on the government. Why not turn to black slaves for workers on the plantation? So they'll be increased in numbers to work the field. One of the things that the white elites will play is a race card telling that the poor whites that they're much better than the blacks and they shouldn't. Uh, they're hoping that they won't form an alliance in the future. So this is a game changer, so you might want to remember Bacon's Rebellion. Now, the Carolina regions is going to be settled in 1670. Uh, while there was a civil war going on back in England, um, colonization is sort of interrupted for a period of time. When Charles II is restored back to the throne, one of the things is he grants a charter for Carolina to be created. And you can see that at one time it was all a tract of land, the Carolinas, and then eventually it's going to be divided into two parts. Uh, Originally, the purpose of the colony was to grow rice for the slaves in the Caribbean, and this will become the main cash flow for those people living in the Carolinas. Charleston will become the seaport that's very vital to the South. Later, North Carolina will be created in 1712 as a refuge for poor whites. Here's the two of the cash crops. They weren't into growing tobacco, but rice and indigo. This shows a picture of the port. Um, and North Carolina will become the most democratic and least aristocratic of the 13 colonies, in similar to Rhode Island. They still have problems with Native Americans, and this will continue for years to come. Georgia would be the last colony to be established in the South in 1733. James Oglethorpe again is given a tract of land in lieu of payment from the king, and he's going to set up Georgia and bring over prisoners from the debtor prisons. The king thinks this is a pretty good colony to create because it will provide a buffer between the Spanish and the English colonies, and who cares about debtor prisoners. So this is a penal colony, similar to what they will do in Australia, they do in Georgia. Oglethorpe was considered a humanitarian, and he will make some money off this venture. And in the meantime, the debtor prisons are going to be cleaned out, and those folks will be sent to Georgia. So, some better for them, perhaps, but many of these debtors who end up in Georgia will die because of the harsh conditions. As far as slavery in the South is concerned, really after 1700 is really when the number of slaves significantly increases. 2,000 in Georgia by 1617 or 1670. By 1750, half the population of Virginia is slaves. The triangular trade, something you'll need to know, basically was slaves being transported to the New World through the Middle Passage, and they would either end up in Brazil, the West Indies, and you can see that they received most of the slaves, and a small number went to North America. This is a notice of a slave auction. South Carolina, well, 2/3 of its population will be slaves. One of the things that they will do in the South to control the slaves is pass harsh slave codes, which essentially said that children were the property of the white slave owners. It was a crime to teach blacks to read and write, and they had absolutely no standing in the courts. Here shows a slave being muzzled, so that it might prevent him from biting or spitting on you. 30 lashes, well, that's the way they punish the slaves. Pretty brutal. If you became a Christian, was not grounds for freedom, you were still going to be a slave. And most of the slave laws were patterned after Barbados, slave codes, which were very harsh. Conditions for the slaves on this long voyage, the Middle Passage, most of them died. It's estimated that about 12 million slaves came over from West Africa during the slave trade. And there was a constant need to import more slaves to raise the sugar in Brazil and in the Caribbean. This showed a description of a slave ship and the way they were packed in. Very inhumane. Often there might be a slave revolt on the ships, but for the most part, this didn't take place too often. If you disobeyed, you were thrown overboard, and the sharks ate you. South was a little paranoid about slaves because they figured that they might rise up and destroy them. And in many places, they outnumbered whites significantly. The first uprising of slaves in North America, the British colonies, it was a Stono Rebellion in 1736. 250 blacks killed 25 whites, tried to escape to Florida where they were promised freedom by the Spaniards. The revolt was quickly crushed and the people killed, and even tighter controls were placed on slaves. In terms of Southern society, it had a well-defined class structure. The plantation owners at the top, people who had small farms were considered the second layer, former indentured servants without land, and you had slaves at the bottom. And by 1775, just prior to the Revolution, 25% or 20% of the colonial population in the South were slaves. South remained underdeveloped for most of the time. There were few cities, primarily agriculture, no roads. Life revolved around plantation life, and they will lag behind the other parts of the colonies in North America, the British colonies. And we'll stop there.